Hello and welcome back to the second part of Humane Resources, Managing Your People Systems with No HR Department. I'm Ainsley Sparks, the Communications and Marketing Manager at BookNet Canada. And as you know from our last session, Jeanne LeSage is an arts consultant with a 30-plus year career, starting as a theater stage manager, working for 10 years at the Toronto International Film Festival in theater operations and human resources, 6 years in international arts projects, including the Kennedy Center for the Performing Arts, the Abu Dhabi Film Festival, and the Royal Opera House, Muscat in Oman. Jeanne is a certified human resources leader, holds an MBA in management consulting, and owns and operates LeSage Arts Management in Toronto with a focus on human resources, organizational effectiveness, strategy, and facilitation. Jeanne is a sought-after speaker and trainer, having delivered sessions on strategic human resources, such as organizational development and effectiveness, performance management, policy development, workplace harassment, and respectful workplaces, and more. Jeanne is a proud volunteer board member for nonprofits Volcano Theatre, Department of Imaginary Affairs, and SM Arts Stage Managing the Arts. Over to you, Jeanne.
Okay. Overview. So last week we covered some what I would call HR 101. We talked about the specifics of your sector and some of the research on that. And we started to really talk about those people systems during COVID. And I asked you to give me some scenarios about some management challenges, which you sent on, and that's great. So today, I'm going to first do a very quick session on respectful workplaces. We're going to talk about the challenges when managing people. And then looking at those management scenarios, you're going to go into some breakout groups to kind of talk about some ideas about strategies surrounding that. And then we'll come back to report back. And I'm going to close with a little bit, I mentioned last time, just a little bit of a reflection for yourselves about leading in uncertain times. And then we will have some time for Q&A. Just a heads up, later in the session, if anybody's used Google Jamboard, we're going to be using that. It's like Google Doc, Google Slides, it's one of those, and we'll give you the link for that. But I just wanted to give a heads up that later on, when we do the breakout rooms, we'll be using the Google Jamboard, and you'll get the link for that later on. And again, one more time, the caveat for me, this is informational. This is an informational session only. Please, if you need legal or HR advice, please seek that out separately. A lot of areas are going to be very different according to your applicable jurisdiction. Okay, so first off, let's talk about respectful workplaces and what that might mean for you and your workplace. Again, pulling in Quill and Choir, once again, have come with some very, very sobering but good research to kind of frame our discussion today. So they held a survey in February 2019 about sexual harassment in the Canadian publishing industry. They had 185 respondents to an anonymous survey. And what did they find? So 53.5% of the respondents reported they experienced harassment in the form of unwanted touching and staring, verbal remarks, and persistent invitations of a sexual nature. 63% have witnessed harassment, assault, or predatory behavior. But 74% did not report the incident. This is an important stat that I wanted to bring in. And those that did report it felt that their employers did not handle the situation to their satisfaction. And the accused harassers were most often peers or colleagues, followed by employers, so that would be somebody in that management relationship, with the remaining being individuals with influence and decision-making power, as well as authors, which in some of that tracked with some of the comments we were chatting about last time about where some of the challenges were coming from. Where did the incidences take place? It took place in the office, book launches, after-hour events, conferences, trade shows, and offsite meetings. And we did talk about, when we were just chatting about specifically what are the HR challenges in the publishing industry, we talked about this similar thing. It's like where, who are the players that are involved? It can be very complex of what the formal structural relationships and the informal ones, as well as where's the where. And because of the small size of this industry, it means that, if somebody had a challenge or an incident with somebody in the past, the chances for them having, coming across this person in some other context is pretty high. And I will say that I mean, I think these percentages and these stats are important to look at when saying that the 74% did not report the incident, and then those that did felt that their employers did not handle the situation. I have great empathy on both sides, because I feel like organizations, it's very, very tough to find the expertise and the bandwidth to know how to respond to these incidents. And I also have a lot of empathy for the individuals going through it. So my aim is really to kind of look at this on all sides about how can the sector, and obviously what we are going to be talking about is on an organizational level, how can we help both sides? So, but let's back up for a second. So when we're talking about respectful workplaces, what exactly are we talking about? We may hear the terms #MeToo, #Time's Up, the terms sexual misconduct, sexual harassment, workplace harassment, workplace violence, bullying, sexual assault, toxic work environment. We may have heard these different terms in a lot of different contexts, and it might be within our sector or the broader arts and culture and heritage sector, or even just in what's happening in Canada and North America right now. So we're going to focus on the issues that are in a work context, but even that, as we discussed, can already be pretty complex. And now let's again talk about our sector. And, you know, I'm not going to go into a ton of detail about the sector because I think we had a really good conversation about this last time. But why do we think it's difficult for our sector to approach this issue? And some of these are the same challenges that I was reviewing our notes from our last week's call about why is it hard to actually handle HR? And some of them are the same reasons why really approaching respectful workplaces and workplace harassment is challenging. First of all, defining sexual assault, workplace harassment, and sexual harassment. I find that there's often, do we have a common baseline of, does everybody kind of understand what each of those mean? We discussed this last time. The blurring of personal and professional happens quite a bit in our sector. And the structural lines are not clear. Somebody's on contract, off contract in the sector. What are the jurisdiction rules that come into play? And then, you know, we had a really good discussion about when it came to authors, and I think this happens a lot in the arts and culture sector, this myth of taking risks for creativity and innovation, or we need to tolerate that behavior because this is a superstar creative person, or, you know, in some cases a super earner. So we're really looking at, why do we allow that to happen in our sector? And we can often say, well, it's different. It's different. And I'd like to kind of come back and challenge that to kind of understand why. This is where I won't go into a ton of detail on, but if we look at the players orbiting each other, you know, if we had longer time, we could dive into each of these bubbles, but we have arts institutions and those functional roles, and each of those might have a board of directors or might not. It might be nonprofit, it might be for-profit with a board, senior management, artistic staff, there's certain office. And then we have the individuals in the spheres. So an employee, volunteer, contract, on contract, past ones, a person in the sector seeking a career. Then we have what I call sector influencers, funders, which could be government, foundations, art service organizations, unions, guilds, associations, sector thought leaders. And then we have the legal and compliance structure, which we're going to talk about in a second. And then we have the public opinion. So what are the avenues of recourse? So just as I mentioned, we might hear the term sexual misconduct, workplace harassment, sexual harassment, when it comes to what I would call the avenues of recourse. So if you've witnessed something or something has happened to you, what are those options? And the reason you may sort of think I'm really going down a rabbit hole, especially of smart art designs here. I think even just making sure we understand the definitions and untangling what the processes are helpful for us as we're leading these workplaces, so that we can try to navigate, how do we approach this? So then if there's something that's happened, there's a number of avenues of recourse. So over on the left, we've got the courts. So if something happens that's against criminal code, you call the police and it goes through the criminal courts. You may have heard cases where somebody will do a statement of claim and it's civil. They'll sue somebody because of something that's happened, which might include workplace harassment. Now, under the statutory, which is where we're going to focus on, you know, we've got employment standards, labor relations for those registered unions, health and safety, human rights. And we know that there's legislation for each of those, and there's mechanisms for each of those, which might be a tribunal, or it might be calling a minister or an inspector. So there's processes up that route. also actually missing on here is something that we chatted about last time, which is members of an association or members of a union or guild. So you might have, and this would not be statutory, but it could be if you have a member of a guild or a member and it's a requirement of that guild or membership to be, applying to policies, things like that. That's another avenue of recourse. And then of course, it's important to notice public opinion. So somebody may decide not to go through the courts and not to go through statutory directions, but I'm going to go to the media, I'm going to go to social media, or I'm going to go to sector influencers and look at things that way. So what does the law say about your obligation as employers, about workplace harassment? So let's just chat about that first. And understanding that on this call, we have folks in different provinces and territories. This is something, unless there's somebody that you have a federal jurisdiction, this is generally something that has got a provincial territorial jurisdiction. And so do remember, I'm going to use Ontario just as a placeholder. And Ontario is one of the more fulsome ones. BC is also, I think, quite fulsome. And if I recall last week, we've also got some folks from Manitoba and maybe some other provinces and territories. And I'm going to give you access to a really good resource that will help each province and territories to the specifics of your jurisdiction. Okay, so what do employers need to know? What are your obligations about workplace harassment? So first of all, and it's again different in each jurisdiction, but in Ontario, in that avenues of recourse, when we're talking about statutory, about ESA, health and safety, human rights, in Ontario, it falls under two jurisdictions. One is the Health and Safety Act, which is at the very, very top level, a requirement to provide a safe workplace. And I would say this started to kind of sit in the health and safety realm, maybe losing my years now. I think it's like about 14 years ago with the beginning of Bill, I think it was 168 and then Bill 32, where harassment might have sat just in human rights. And then it became well, you know what, this is health and safety. We need to provide a safe workplace that's free from harassment. And then of course, under the human rights lens, where we have a requirement to provide employment free of discrimination and removal of impediments for all to participate. And of course, on that side, when it comes to sexual harassment, it's on a gender base. So let's talk about workplace harassment under Ontario health and safety. So in the starting principles, and then we're going to talk about some definitions and kind of dive into about ways that you can approach this. Harassment in the workplace can be a continuum of unwanted behaviors towards a worker from any person in that workplace. So, and we will talk about definitions because it's important to kind of follow the track of those definitions and how this tracks through. So it's a continuum of unwanted behaviors towards a worker. These could be perpetrated by another worker or a client or a volunteer or a customer. And a lot of the things that were discussed were about, is this something that's happening from an artist, from an author, but the fact is what we're talking about is if this is happening to one of your quote unquote workers. Under those key definitions, so let's just get a little bit more specific. And again, this is Ontario. This is under the Health and Safety Act. Workplace harassment means engaging in a course of vexatious comment or conduct. So it can be comment or conduct against a worker that is known or ought reasonably known to be unwelcome. So again, it's about the impact and not intent. And harassment can include that psychological harassment, which we might see as bullying, toxic work behavior, as well as sexual harassment and workplace sexual harassment. A workplace is anywhere the worker works. So an office, when performing arts, it's rehearsal hall, donor event, venue, author launch, bookshop. So the workplace is where the worker works. And a worker, I have good discussions with my health and safety consultant pals, and how the worker is defined. Is it just employees? Is it your employees plus your independent contractors? Is it also your volunteers, your interns? And of course, volunteers, in some cases, your volunteers are board members, work placements. Even if we don't agree on exactly what the legal definition is, I think it's smart for you to look at your kinds of policies and programs that covers anybody that's quote unquote a worker. Harassment, so workplace harassment, remember we talked about it was like comment or conduct that's unwelcome, and it's either known to be unwelcome or reasonably to be known to be unwelcome. It can be making remarks, jokes, innuendos. It can be displaying or circulating offensive pictures. It can be bullying, repeated offensive or intimidating phone calls, or it could be workplace sexual harassment, which is a subset under harassment. Now, just a quick stopgap, because then managers start to think, well, am I allowed to talk to my staff in certain ways? Like, is everything I say, and if I give direction and feedback, is that going to be harassment? There's some allowance in the act to say reasonable management direction is not harassment, as long as it's not done in a way that where the tone could be construed as angry or toxic, and if it's exercised reasonably and fairly. And differences of opinions or minor disagreements, especially if it's a one time, it would not generally be considered to be workplace harassment. Workplace sexual harassment, we've got that first bullet point, which is the same definition as before: vexatious comment or conduct. But in this time, because of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, where the comment or conduct is known to be unwelcome. The second one, which is important to kind of understand that distinction, is about that piece that's about a power dynamic. So it's also can be about making a sexual solicitation or advance where the person making that is in a position to confer, grant, or deny a benefit for advancement to the worker. So that's an important distinction. But the base harassment, there's been lots of awareness, and when Me Too and Time's Up were happening, which a lot of it was about sexual harassment. And then there was a second wave that was about that workplace harassment, that's about toxic workplaces and bullying. Okay, I realize this is a lot of information. You'll get copies of these, and there's examples of what these kinds of harassment, how they might be manifest. But how do we look at creating our policies? And this is why I want to make sure that I give you something in your hands that you can go away, especially as we've talked about, how do you do this without an HR department? So employers are required to have a policy and a program. And this is very important, because the policy can be that one pager about this is what it is and we don't condone it and zero tolerance. The program, or what our ear might actually twig towards as a process, is how do you implement this? And it's very important to look at both. And it can often be that we have a good policy, but do we have a good program? Meaning, how do we carry this out? So what are the elements of a policy and a program? And again, I'm using Ontario. You need to say that you have a commitment to protecting workers. You need to confirm that the harassment's from all sources. And then you be clear about the roles and responsibilities of all. And then you need to have that dated and signed by the highest level of management or employer, employer. And it should be reviewed annually. Now, OSA, the Ontario, there's a sample policy that's included in there. And I'm going to give you another art-specific resource that has got some samples as well. Now, the program, which is how you carry that out, this is very, very important. And it's tougher for small orgs because there's not a lot of who is in the org, but it's really important to kind of be clear and have in writing a policy about what is your reporting procedure. So who is the main contact? If somebody reads it and goes, yes, I think this all applies, who do I report that to? And then, of course, you need an alternate contact. So quite often it's the ED or the CEO that is the contact. So the policy will say, contact the ED if you want to issue a complaint. And then if that person is the alleged harasser, you need to provide an alternate contact. If you've got a board of directors, it's often that, because that's outside of the reporting line. It gets tougher when it's the owner and then there is no person above you. And then how will the employer investigate and deal with incidents or complaints? And that often gets into confidentiality and disclosure rules. And then what will happen with the results of an investigation? Now, I will say, and again, there's a sample program that's in that health and safety guide. I will say, for folks that are here from BC, WorkSafe, I find, and actually for anybody in any provinces, WorkSafe in BC has a ton of great tools, right down to here's a PowerPoint for a training program. Here's like an info sheet. Here's a poster. They've done a lot of, I find, really useful on the ground tools to translate all of that. So, but if you're in Ontario or any other province, again, you need to kind of make it your own. Investigations, I don't want to get too far into this because it's a really great conversation for when we have more time. And I've done a certain amount of research on reporting and investigating mechanisms. What the law says is that if you become aware of an incident or if a report is brought to you, you have a duty to investigate. And so what does investigate mean? It's going to depend. And this is now you're getting the consultant. Well, what is an investigation? It depends. In Ontario, it says that the investigation needs to be appropriate to the circumstances. So for example, if it's brought forward and it's maybe, I'm going to use example, it's two volunteers and there's a conflict, you might be able to handle that internally. If the investigation, if something comes forward and it's about your leader or maybe your board leadership, you might need to bring in some outside help. I think you need, and this is the tough part. And when I was doing the research, I was trying to find what's the decision tree and how do we provide you the analytical scientific results of how do you deal with it? And there isn't. It has to depend on who are the players involved and how serious is the incident, the alleged incident that comes forward. The investigation could be carried out by someone in the workplace. It can be an external person, which could be a lawyer, an HR professional. There are licensed investigators. I've given you a list here of like what an investigation might include, but it's really something that you need to look at case by case. Okay. So again, the employer's obligations, I'm just going to kind of go back up top line again. You need to provide a workplace free of harassment. You need to have that policy and then that set of procedures and processes in place. And you have a duty to react in an effective manner and to investigate. And again, please keep in mind, in Ontario, it's actually pretty clear that, because there's been some cases in the past, it's like, well, there wasn't a formal complaint. They didn't fill out the form, so I don't need to do anything. In some jurisdictions, the powers that be may say, well, you knew that this was happening. You had a duty to look into this. You had a duty to investigate. So just kind of have a think about that. And then I think it's also good to think about knowing the minimums from that legal point of view, but can we do more? And I know this is a big conversation that's happening in the sector. Is there more that we can do? And a lot of that, I think, will start to go back to overall systemic change and overall systemic prevention. I mean, really, we just don't want the behavior to happen in the first place, but we've got all these mechanisms so that folks involved have a way to seek out help. Okay, so how do I create my policy? Again, and you'll get a link to this. So the Culture Human Resources Council, there's a couple of resources I think here that are useful for the arts, culture, and heritage sector. The screenshot that you're seeing is an HR management toolkit, which was created by Williams HR Consulting. I referenced Laura and her firm last time. She and her firm done a brilliant overview of workplace harassment, but also fact sheets on the legislation across the provinces and territories. And attached to that, there's also a number of resources and info sheets, and there's some templates and procedures. If you really want to know more, if you want to go down the research rabbit hole, I did author a research report on reporting and investigating mechanisms. That's also on the CHRC. But there's also some sector codes of conduct. Codes of conduct, I think, are wonderful. What I'm seeing in some of these codes of conducts that are happening, so I've listed a couple of them here. And in fact, I forgot to ask Lauren if there's a sector-wide one in the literary. So I'm wondering if maybe somebody can, if they know of one. There's not. Okay. I mean, the sector codes of conducts tend to be folks coming together to say, here's what our values are. Here's what we want to subscribe to. I think codes of conducts can be very, very useful. They're not policy. And I want to be super clear about that. And the codes of conducts, it is you coming together, and it might be various orgs in a sector coming together to say, this is what's important to us. These are our values. But they don't tend to have our mechanisms and procedures and remedies. So, and that's okay, because they don't actually have the jurisdiction to do so. In most cases, that has to be under that employer umbrella. But it's a good start to say, here's what we all agree to in our values. But I really think on an employer level, you need to kind of move to that policy and program level so that you've got something for your organization. So how do we do this? So like we talked about this with the HR policy. One size does not fit all. I'm a fan of borrowing best practices and looking at templates, but you need to then take it and make it customized for yourself. One size does not fit all. So how can you create yours? Similar to the HR piece, you really need to think about in your organization, who's going to own this? Who's going to own own the overall, and it might be the same as when I see this question about your HR function, but it could be that you might be able to have some of the HR functions with various staff members, but it might be that the looking at respectful workplace harassment policy needs to sit with the leader. It might be an HR staff member. You could have a staff member with an interest in HR, or a board member, or maybe a board governance committee, but be clear about it. I think this is the part where I'm saying with that program piece is, can somebody very easily go to find out, so if I bring something forward, who's this going to go to and what's going to happen? Actually, I think we talked about this last week about policy. Maybe do peers of like size, like complexity, do you come together to create a policy and a program? Do you kind of share resources, but you still need to customize? Go back to those key principles of what the legislation asks for as a minimum and see if there's more that you want to do. And I just urge you, in any of your policies and procedures, just make them clear and reasonable. Can a new person coming into your orbit, can they clearly understand what to do? Because think about the point of view, if somebody has witnessed something, or if something has happened to them, they're already going to be in a place of stress, or in a fair amount of crisis. So do they know where to go to without having to ask somebody? Because there's going to be an element where they're going to want to do this very discreetly. And when they read that, is it going to be clear to them what will happen if I come forward? So you both want those policies and programs to be clear and fair, but also just like, I want to know the disclosure. So if I bring this forward, who's going to be reading this and what will happen? The challenge is, as I said, with investigations, there's so many myriad combinations of what could happen. But I think it's important to go, if you send this here, it's going to be read by the ED, and then it will be brought forward to a committee XYZ, and then we will look into it and figure out what the investigation is. And there's examples of processes that talk about what will happen. And of course, if you have a union or a guild or association, you need to dovetail that with, if they have a procedure, you need to make sure that your policy aligns and dovetails with that. Talk to your unions, guilds to partner with them. It could be that if they have a process that will work. Confirm, I send this as a reminder, confirm all the kinds of workplaces. So back in your definitions, confirm that any place that you have a worker work is going to be a workplace. And then once you have your policies, post it in all the various digital and physical spaces where you might have folks. Okay, I'm going to pause there. Oh, actually, no, the last point I want to point out, even though I've said I want somebody to own this, like, for example, an ED or a CEO, if you have any folks in your organization that are supervisors or who interact with people, make sure that there's training, so that we're really kind of reviewing what the obligations are and what folks need to do. And anybody, and I wrote here, train supervisors and those who are in a power dynamic, including your authors and artists. So we chatted about this last week. So, can we actually ask authors to comply with this? Do we actually kind of bake this into various agreements? And, the Pollyanna in me says, yes, bake this into any kinds of agreements or contracts to say, this is our policy, here's how we function, and need to understand that you realize that this is how we work. Okay. Just a very quick thing, and then we're going to go into questions. So I will say, often the biggest question that comes forward for organizations, like a lot of what I've talked about is like, how do you put in your policy or program? So what is that preventative piece? And I know what then happens is it can be challenging to know what to do if something gets brought to you. So a lot of what we've just talked about is before an incident. And I think it's, if you're really sitting down in your organization to talk about what you need to do, break it down into, what do you need to do before an incident happens, during an incident, or during the point when it's being reported to you, and then after an incident. And maybe really try to map that out and think about all those pieces. We've talked a lot about the prevention piece, which is about policy, which is about training, and about how you bake that into your organizations. During an incident, it's a longer conversation about how do you manage something when it's happening. And this is where having all that pre-work is going to be much much more helpful for you. I'm not going to lie to you, when something comes forward, and I think anybody that's been through it, it's very, very challenging. Even when you have a clear policy, you might even have a clear rep. When it comes forward, it still can be a very, very challenging thing. And then I think also talking after an incident. So if you've dealt with the incident, you've done an investigation, there may or may not have been findings, you've worked it out, there's still some work to do after the fact to talk about, okay, did our policies work? Do we need to kind of go back? Do we need to do a little bit of healing in the workplace? You know, what is it that we need to look at now? I'd love to kind of move on. I will bring up actually one quick thing, which is just to talk a little bit about the kinds of scenarios that might come into play when it comes to respectful workplace, which is specific to your industry. We've seen the blurring of lines with friendships, partners, former partners, and you know, some scenarios that came up were, what are the optics that there's personal relationships that are advancing, or maybe there's relationships outside of the workplace that go sour, which then brings in conflict. How do we deal with that blurring of lines with friendships, partners, former partners? It's very, very common. I think that the trick is, you know, dealing with that first one about the optics of personal relationships that are advancing. Depending on the context here, if you're the leader of the organization, and maybe I'm going to use just an example, then you have got a department head, and it's perceived that that department head is advancing one person because of personal relationship. It's a big thing to untangle. I think you need to kind of then go back to seeing, what are your overall policies? How has recruitment been happening? How are those decisions made? And are you transparent about it? And I think if they start to come up, you might be wise to kind of look into it before it kind of becomes a larger issue. The second point about relationships outside of the workplace going sour, which then brings in conflict, your job is not to solve the personal relationship outside of the workplace, but what you can talk about is what's above the surface. I think when we talked about the iceberg last time, so you can, you know, you may know that there's the outside relationship. You might need to kind of bring the folks in and say, and sort of figure out that line and go, you know, I'm not sure what's happening outside, but here's what's happening in the workplace, and here's what needs to happen in the workplace. There's another case here where a manager treats their direct report like a best friend, and the report feels obligated to spend personal time, answer calls, things like that. I think in this first case, the advice that I would give that person, or, you know, I guess the question here is like, are we giving advice to the person who's involved, is this becoming a borderline thinking about harassment? And this is where this will feel really tricky, because it may not be coming in negative tones, it may not be coming in a negative vibe, but it is kind of like we're crossing a line. And so if this person came to me, I just might give them some advice about trying to put some boundaries in place, and try to kind of sort of step forward and just kind of say, you know what, I need to kind of create some lines here. It is tricky, because you may feel like that's going to affect your career and advancement. And I think it's always a tricky thing to navigate. And this is where one hopes, if there is some form of a process that, you know, you can try to solve it head on first. And if not, you've got a process to kind of to access if something happens. And the other piece about a manager giving preferential treatment to some direct reports due to their personal relationship. I think in this case, if there was somebody senior to this folks, to kind of say, okay, we need to really talk about what the lines are, and starting to kind of remove those boundaries and try to unblur the lines. Okay, I'm going to move on to talk about management challenges. So we're going to switch gears a little bit. We're still talking about managing people, but this was the folks from BookNet really wanted to make sure that we had some time to talk about some other dimensions in managing people. So very, very top line. So, you know, each of these areas we could have a training session to kind of go in depth, but talking about managing people, just a couple top line pieces. And I wanted to pull in a couple of different research pieces that I pulled in, and a lot of this is going to feel very obvious to you. So factors for job satisfaction. Why do people end up having really good job satisfaction? Often it's because they've got a positive relationship with their immediate supervisor and senior management. They've got well-defined responsibilities and role clarity. They're getting continuous feedback, positive reinforcement, constructive criticism, regular reviews. job security, opportunities for advancement, professional development. And we chatted last time that the feeling in the sector was the opportunity advancement is particularly difficult in your organizations just because structurally they might be smaller organizations. And then they also really respond well to a strong work environment and a strong work culture. What's the vibe? Do they like where they work? And then, of course, absolutely compensation and benefits. And we know that it's challenging in a resource scarce sector to be able to provide a high level of compensation and benefits. So if you can't, then I say, then you really need to kind of nail these other ones. I mean, you should nail them all, but in a nonprofit sector and even in a for-profit sector, but that's resource scarce, you know, if you're not going to be able to attract and retain with comp and benefits, then really kind of look at these other pieces. So performance management, and again, very, very top line, you know, how are we managing performance? And I'm gonna just take us through, I'm gonna just skip ahead a little bit, a cycle. We love our cycles. We love cycles, and we love cycles that feed back in on themselves. If I really talk top line about performance management, yes, there's the performance review form, there's the very awkward evaluation meeting, and there's the form, and we do all of this. But I want to step back and talk about the culture of performance management. How do we manage our staff? And I'm gonna say at the top of everything, either in your job posting, when you've hired somebody, or with an ongoing staff member at the beginning of whatever your natural cycle is, your natural year is, set some goals and standards at the beginning of that year. So even somebody that's been there for 10 years, it's sitting down. So to me, the performance review process happens all year. And you're like, great, thanks. We get to do this awkward thing all year long. And I guess my point is, the more you do it, the less awkward it becomes. The more we normalize these kinds of discussions about feedback, about performance, the more we normalize it, the more we can kind of just embed it into the way we work. But if we look at top line at this cycle, so at the top of your year, and now for some folks, it's the calendar year. It really depends on the natural flow of your operations. For some people, it's September to August, calendar year, whatever you want that to be. Sit down and set some goals and standards for the year. And just say, you know, you've got your ongoing job description, but let's talk about what are the big priorities this year. Remember we talked about the pyramid last time. I like to think that fits into your department's goals, your org's goals, and your strategy. So it all is lined up. But here's the goals that we have for the year in the department. Here's what I would like you to focus on. Then also the employee can say, well, here's my goals for the year. I'd like to be able to learn more about this. I'd like to learn more about this. Sit down and talk about those at the beginning. And then you're giving feedback on a regular basis. And then at the end of that period, you do your formal review, and the employee does a self-review. So therefore, when you sit down to have that majorly awkward meeting and conversation, it's not a surprise because you've been trying to talk about these things all year. So that's my very quick 101 about performance management and feedback. So what if there's a problem? What if there's a challenge? What do we do? And so I'm jumping to this part because I want us to kind of get into this in our management challenges and our scenarios and our breakout groups. So if there's a challenge, you've shared with folks, here's what you want them to do, you're giving them feedback, but what if there's a challenge? So if there's concerns with performance, how do we deal with it? First, do a bit of detective work. And so I often say when I'm working and coaching with organizations and supervisors about when they're managing staff, if there's something going on with performance, do a bit of detective work, break down the issue. So what exactly is the issue or problem you're trying to improve? Which might seem really obvious, but sometimes it's not so clear. So what is really the issue that you're trying to improve? What's happening? And then why? Do we know why this is happening? Can we figure out the reasons why there is an issue? And you'll hear me repeat this off and on and in different forms. So when we're talking about giving feedback and doing performance management, which these are tough conversations, it's personal, it's talking about the person's work, which people have great ownership over, and the work that we do is very often very qualitative. It's not strictly just kind of, you know, numbers based or empirical. So I will often say, focus on the task and not the person, focus on the behavior and not the personality. This is the task I asked you to do. Here's how I would like you to do it. It didn't happen to standard, so let's talk about that. Not you did a bad job. So, because then it immediately kind of drops the person out of like really focusing on, here's the work that I need you to get done and how I want you to do it. Because I want you to be generous in your conversations with staff. You still have things to get done and you still have a level of quality that you want that work to be done at. And so I'm really trying to work to get you to both. Another framework to think about, talking about before was like, what is really wrong and why? Why is it going south? The other is about ability versus motivation. So the issue that's happening, is this a task-based issue and they just need they just need the tools and training to get it done? Or, why are they continually not able to get that report done correctly in that database? And then you might need to kind of step back and go, how's your computer? Do you have access? Did you get trained on this? Do you actually know how to do it? And then motivation. Is there some kind of a motivational issue that's getting in the way? It's like, well, they knew how to do it before, but all of a sudden they're not doing it. And I wonder why that is. And again, same thing. Don't paint the person with one brush. So saying, they're with them, it's always an ability thing. And with them, it's always a motivation thing. It's breaking down these tasks to kind of try to go, what's going on here? Some of the issues in their work might be an ability issue and some of them might be motivation. And what I often say, if you sort of figure out that it's an ability issue, it can actually be far easier to deal with, because it might just be like, oh, okay, well, maybe we can tweak this and we'll get you the access to the tools you need. We can get you the training and we can work on that. Motivation's a bit trickier because it's just getting into that complexity of why something is happening. So how do we resolve the issue? So obviously the solution is going to depend on the issue itself and also your relationship with the employee, meaning, you supervise people and some of them, they might be very new to the sector and new to their job. And so you are really micromanaging them and coaching them and teaching them how to do it. You may also have staff members that they know their portfolio. So you're almost like a mentor or a coach to them. I mean, you're still accountable for what they need to get done, but your relationship with them was quite different. So again, focus on the situation, not the emotions, and focus on the task, not the person, focus on the behavior and not the personality. So how do we eliminate some barriers? So if we've tried to figure out the what and the why, we've tried to break it down. Do we think this is ability-based or motivation-based? Maybe there's also barriers. So are there organizational barriers at play? So barriers that might exist because, they don't have access to the person that needs to make decisions. They don't have the authority to carry things out. Try to eliminate those barriers about what are the ways that I can help you solve to do a better job on this task. Okay. Personal barriers. These are trickier to navigate. Same thing with that motivation side. It might be, is there some reason why they don't want to approach this job? Is there something has changed? And as we talked last time about that iceberg, when we were sort of talking about wellness, is it something that's actually happening on the outside of the organization and it's actually not related? Is there some dynamic that's changed? Maybe the person who's their contact in another department or externally, there's a challenge in that relationship. We're just not sure. You're just, again, trying to kind of figure out all the pieces behind it. And then of course the COVID challenges, which we talked about quite a bit last week. So I'm not going to go line by line, but we know that there's also challenges with COVID. We're remote workplaces, never ending changes and contingency, capacity, how much can we be working, juggling to get work done as well as our own wellness and just the honesty of things. There's one more scenario that came up that I wanted to kind of roll into just a bit of a last reflection for yourselves as leaders, this pandemic leading and uncertainty. And I just want to share with you this scenario that came through that I think we can, and it's a longer one, but let's just like take it in for a moment. Due to pandemic, budgets were cut, hours and staff were cut. There's some staff resentment early on about budget being cut, government benefits, wages and hours were reduced. And then of course, for the folks that were left, workloads were higher and they were getting paid less. And so this is past now. So what this person has said is, early on in the pandemic, this happened and there was, tough pieces, some resentment, and this is all past. So, but what is the best way to approach a situation like this now in the future so that staff can have a different perspective moving forward? There were always very open discussions at the company about finances and the goal to ensure that no one gets laid off. So handling staff that is disgruntled is tricky. So it's actually that similar thing about enforcing social time. So if in this case, it sounds like this person was very open about we're going to try to do this, so we're all going to take less so that everybody keeps their job, and that's a business decision that happened. And then the result is being disgruntled about the amount of work left, less money, all that kind of stuff. So the very, very good question is, what is that level of communication and transparency that should happen? Now, some of it's, if I was chatting with this person, I would probably first say, please give yourself a little bit of a break on this, because I think nobody knew how to respond to what I will call Q1 and Q2 of the pandemic, and maybe Q3. And then we kind of all sort of slid into home base in Q4. So first of all, like I hear and feel the struggle that this person, because you're trying to make decisions of what's going on, and if you have a board, you're talking to your board and the funders, what's happening, and you had to make the best decisions that you had with the information available. So I wanted to bring this scenario up separately, because I want you all to kind of really exercise some really great care for yourselves, because we can second guess the decisions that we had to make in Q1, Q2, and Q3 of the pandemic. Who knew any of this information? Who knew what kind of training and preparation would be required for any of this? And so you had to make decisions. I love that this person is reflecting back to say, so if we had to do that again, what would we do? But I actually do want to pause a moment and just kind of say, listen, we had to make decisions. Do not be hard on yourself for what you perceive as, and I've heard this with other leaders where it's like, I made mistakes, XYZ. You made the best optimal decision with the available data. And that's pretty great. And you made decisions and you move forward, which is, we should all sort of be rock stars for making decisions, taking action, moving forward in the midst of this. So I'm just going to we're going to have a pause right there and go, okay, like no blame, no, like I made a wrong decision. What I love is now the reflection of so if we had to do that again, what would we do differently? Okay. And, it is a very, very tricky notion about, first of all, and this person is not questioning what the decision was. It's like, how would you have handled it with staff? So I want to just bring forward just a little bit of a leading and uncertainty framework that I've gathered from you from a management consulting firm, and it's one that I think is really interesting for us to think about, and it's, I think, a nice reflection as we kind of roll on into the long weekend. So you're all good, smart leaders. You've already been juggling with the cash flows, the endless programming scenarios, moving to digital, balancing multiple constituents, new funding instruments. And so now let's step back, talk about how are you going to lead in this ongoing place of uncertainty. And we really don't know how long it's going to be. And I've brought this forward to you. And again, RHR International is it's a corporate management firm, but they're industrial psychologists who knew that was a thing, who are very smart people in terms of working with leaders about how you lead in these times. And they bring forward 4 principles that I'd like you to kind of think about and reflect on. So if you're going to be looking at leadership best practices in uncertainty, let's talk about, so we're going to look at how we inform, how do we connect, how do we guide, and how do we unite? And I think some of this actually is addressed in a lot of these scenarios that we've talked about. So what do these mean? So inform. So you as a leader with your team, and also with your team, you're often leading up to your board, assessing challenges head on, sharing the available data, acknowledge that we are in uncertainty, counter those feelings of helplessness with focusing on the controllable, and anticipating scenarios while focusing on strengths, which I will say that person did that. They said, we are in uncertainty. We are in a tough jam. Here's the data. Counter those feelings of helplessness. Then we need to connect. And we've talked about this. Reach out and give that support, the warmth, that reassurance. Give people the chance to safely express their emotion in this time. Ask folks what they need. but also be honest in expressing your own feelings. And that can be a very tough, vulnerable place. And it can feel like a place of weakness. It's like, well, if I tell you I don't know what's going on, you're going to question my leadership. And it's a balance. And this is why I like to actually think about all four of these together. But then you do need to guide. You need clarity and focus. You need to be realistic about what can be accomplished, having that sense of urgency and providing feedback, because you do need to make decisions. That is your, it's the burden and the responsibility and the joy of leadership. And then unite. And what I love about the sector that we work in is, finding that shared purpose, a sense of community and the connectedness. What's amazing is that we work in a very mission-driven sector that's based on your art and based on that work. So having that way to unite, that shared purpose, sense of community, I think this is what's amazing about the work that we do. And this is where I'm, look, again, sort of try to find that balance. You need to inform people, but you need to connect them and also guide. Like, we do need to stand up and make decisions and make sure folks are facing the right directions. And then looking at that shared purpose and that sense of community. So what I might leave you with is to kind of think about what are the kinds of things that you might look at in each of these areas. We've actually talked about a lot of these already. So when we were talking about, do we have the social hour, we make sure that folks are connected and you're seeing them on screen, so that we're kind of making sure people are okay. You are kind of saying, here's the data we know. You can't be transparent with every single piece of data, because as we know in leadership, you can't always share everything. There are some pieces that need to remain confidential, but share what you can. Be really honest. It's when you don't know something, like, just be really clear. We're not sure about this, but this is what we know. And I love this, like, focus on the controllable, so that for staff, they know that here's some pieces that we can work on. And how are the ways that you're coming back to that shared purpose, sense of community. Maybe if those social half hours that we were talking about in that scenario, people are kind of feeling, oh, I don't want to do another trivia thing and blah, blah, blah. Maybe you look at a purpose-driven piece, like looking at your mission. And if you're looking at the kinds of work and authors and communities, maybe the social hour is like a way to get connected back with the work and the mission that you do. And also, like, being good to yourself, like really kind of giving yourself some time and space, because we're doing the best we can. And in the meanwhile, last week and this week, I've also piled on a bunch more things I want you to do, but being very good to yourself and just being mindful about how you approach everything. And I think that might be a good place to leave us with that reflection. And, maybe even think about, also connect with your staff. Look at those 4 dimensions about how can we do this together.